So that's me, Roger Meacock. Natural Healing Solutions has been my name of my practice since 2000. So here we go on to Bovaer. So I think everybody's probably heard of Bovaer. They've seen the Arla tweets and all the rest of it. So currently Bovaer is licensed in the UK as a feed additive for lactating cows. Licensed for beef in other countries. And the active ingredient is called 3-nitrooxypropanol. Propanol. It's also got silicon dioxide and ethylene glycol in it. And it inhibits an enzyme, methyl coenzyme M reductase in the rumen, which is the big stomach where all the grass ferments normally for those who are not farmers. But no one's done any studies, as far as I can see, to see what effect that might have on the microbiome, which, as we know, is hugely important for immunological health and also mental health as well. And I don't believe that animals have any less implications for their mental health than the humans do, so apart from the immune ones as well. And there's also other effects that we're discovering with the microbiome all the time. So we just really have no idea when the microbiome is 90% of the organism. Once you start introducing changes and imbalances in that, we really don't know what the long-term effects of doing that are. According to its data sheet, you need full PPE for handling it because it's a skin and eye irritant, they're not the same, and it's harmful if inhaled. So it's been passed by the Food Safety Authority and FSS in Scotland, Food Safety Scotland. So there's been no VMD assessment for the animal health and welfare. And I've had that in an email from the Chief Veterinary Officer because I wrote to the VMD and I questioned why they hadn't authorised it as a pharmaceutical like the FDA had. So the trials are relatively short. There's only 15 weeks is the longest trial period where cattle were fed Bovaer, which obviously consider that relative to a 305-day lactation and then multiple lactations in a row. We haven't got any long-term data. So I don't care how scientific someone is sitting on their committee. If you haven't got the data, you can't analyse it. And that's the bottom line. What they did find, however, that some of the ovaries became smaller. There was unsure about the genotoxicity, which is obviously the effect on the DNA. And high doses caused cancer in rats, but we don't know, obviously they're not going to feed that high dose, but we don't know what the cumulative effect is because they haven't done the studies for long enough to see whether there is some sort of accumulation of that. There's been some unconfirmed reports from Denmark where it is mandated from farmers who have been forced to feed Bovaer but who daren't speak out, that it causes diarrhea, fever, induced food intake, and also therefore milk drop, and increases mastitis, probably again low energy, immune system depressed and all the rest of it. So the idea that it has been assessed and found to be healthy is obviously completely wrong. The typical UK diet, a lot of this work was obviously done in the States where there are a lot of grain lot cattle over there, much more so than we tend to have over here. And the diet that was typically fed in the UK has got much higher level of a certain type of fibre, which means that the Bovaer has an even less of an action anyway. So, you know, what are we trying to achieve? So moving on to, it takes us into climate, starting off with methane. So methane is only present at 1,911 parts per billion. So it's 0.0001911% of the atmosphere. Some insects also produce methane. E.g. termites alone produce 20 to 30 tons per annum, which is compared to the ruminant 120 odd tons. You know, so you've got one species producing a quarter of the methane that ruminants supposedly produce, and that's only an estimate as well. So, and there'll be other reasons why it's being produced. So the rumen, obviously, we've got this big fermentation vat where all these plants are fermenting to create the energy that feeds the cows. And it's never been a problem. And it's going to produce methane, which is then going to go onto CO2 and water, which are supposedly greenhouse gases as well, but even worse than methane. So all we're doing, a bit like Sandy was saying, how they moved coal and steel and production from the UK over into China and India, all we're trying to do with Bovaer is move it from inside the cow to outside the cow, and then saying how great we are because we've done that. And it's like forgetting what damage it does to the cow in the process, or potentially the milk. They say it's safe, but again, how long have they done the studies to prove that on a cumulative basis? So methane was never a problem when huge herds of ruminants roamed the planet. It's got a 10-year carbon cycle anyway, so the hydrogen that does produce will become water vapour, which are supposedly worse greenhouse gases if they exist outside the rumen. So the methane is broken down as part of this 10-year cycle by methanotropic bacteria in soil, trees and water, and it's sequestered in the ice. So it's released by the warming, the same as a lot of the CO2 is sequestered in the sea. It's why when you have a glass of champagne, the bubbles get more as it warms up in your hand. The bubbles keep coming because it's the gas coming out of what was sequestered in the drink. So in the same way, when you've got gas sequestered in ice, in something cold, as it warms, then it's released. And that's the order that it happens, not what they tell us. If we look at the cattle population graphs, they don't match the methane graphs either. There we go. Perfect match. Can't you see cattle are obviously to blame for this change in methane? And that's exactly over the same number of years. So Earth temperature is primarily determined by our position relative to the sun. Who'd have thought it? The sun's solar activity, we get cycles of solar activity, and adiabatic heating, which is the pressure from all the atmosphere on the Earth, and that's what creates our temperature. The sun itself has cycles of activity, such as the 11-year sunspot cycle, that are not included in climate models. The Earth has other cycles, known as Milankovitch cycles. They're not included either. Our geomagnetic field, which protects us from excess solar radiation, that also will have effect as to what radiation gets through, as to what heating effect you get on the planet too. Consequently, comparing annual temperatures is not comparing like with like. So the original hockey stick graph that was used to justify this climate alarmism is a snapshot in time. They've taken a very short period of time to justify what they think they want to do. And it's left many questions unanswered. And the original authors refused to share the original data. That's how much scrutiny they're prepared to be exposed to. So you've got to say, well, if you're not prepared, if you're that sure of your theory and the data was that conclusive to come up with that conclusion, you would be happy to share your data, but they aren't. Why not? These are the Milankovitch cycles. So you've got one is eccentricity. Basically the circuit that we make around the sun, that will change. It will expand and contract in certain cycles as well. We've got the tilt of the planet, that also has its changes and it goes in its own little cycle. And there's all these other Milankovitch cycles which change how we are orientated to the sun, which will change our climate. So let's going on to climate myths themselves. So CO2 is only currently at 420 parts per million, which is 0.042%. Well below the 6,000 parts per million when Earth was at its greenest, and much closer to the 150 parts per million below which life cannot survive. And as I've seen recently, there's now question marks as to whether the 280 figure that they had just before the Industrial Revolution is even accurate itself. How convenient. There is no planetary greenhouse effect. Convection determines the Earth's temperature regulation. All climate modelling is therefore based on relief. There is no greenhouse effect. There's no radiation effect. Because if you think about it, the heat hits the ground, then it bounces back. And apparently what the greenhouse gases do is they bounce that heat back. But actually, if heat hits a molecule and it radiates out, do you think it just goes back to the ground, or do you think maybe 50% of it carries on out in another direction? So we only get 50% bounce back. And then that bounces back up again, and another 50% bounces back, and another 50% goes out. So over time, all the heat that supposedly the greenhouse gases are keeping in is actually being radiated out as well. But that is all happening at the speed of light. So it's, you might get a delay in temperature or heat radiation from the Earth by a few minutes, but that's it. There is no heat. But yet, if you think about it, on a summer day, you've got all the heat, and if the cloud is there, then it stays like a warm, muggy night, doesn't it? But if the sky is empty and there's no cloud, it gets cooler. So it's not the gases which are changing the heat, what's heating the Earth, because otherwise it'd be consistent every day, every night, whether it was winter or sun. What's actually changing it is the cloud cover, it's the convection, and this makes all these ideas of net zero, and Sandy didn't mention it, but there was actually an absolute zero behind that as well. So there was actually a government investigation or paper where they're saying they actually want to get down to absolute zero. And when they say that they're supporting farming, one of the slides that Sandy had, they want to get our meat consumption down to 0 kilos per person by 2030, but they think that might be a bit too much. So they're going to go for 16 kilos per person per year, which is and 0 dairy. So when governments say they are supporting farming, how can they say they're supporting farming when their ultimate aim, whether they achieve it by 2030 or 2040, is immaterial? If their ultimate aim is to get meat consumption down to 0 and dairy consumption down to 0 because they want all these other food patches and jellyfish that Sandy was mentioning, it's totally disingenuous to say that the government is supporting farming. They aren't. So, as I've already said, temperature rises precedes CO2 because as the ice melts and the seas get warmer, supposedly, then they release their gases, and that's what creates the increase in CO2. It's based on poor modelling. The real data does not support the theory, and there's actually been evidence where they've been going around and doctoring the early data to try and make it look what they want to make it look like. Only 3% of the CO2 emissions are man-made. You show me any system where 3% of what is produced governs the whole system more than the 97%. I don't think it exists. We need the increased CO2 for plant growth. In those greenhouses all over where they're increasing the CO2 in those buildings to increase growth and yields. And we need the cattle for soil. We need it for regenerative farming. Alan Savory in Africa has been rewilding and greening areas of Africa by having nomadic herds which leave their dung and eat the foliage there. And that actually has caused all this regreening of the planet. So we know that we need it, and obviously a lot of the land that's being farmed is suitable for growing grass, but it may not necessarily be suitable for growing other more intensive crops. And we know that monoculture actually decreases all the nutrient value of the food over time because we're depleting the soil so much. So we need to get back to regenerative farming. So this is actually a graph over millions of years of CO2 and global surface temperature. As you can see, we're sort of on that far edge of the graph. So you can see where it's been before. So the idea we're getting to a point where the planet is actually under danger of from where we're heading is complete myths. And of course, this is the rubbish that they're teaching the kids, so that kids are genuinely fearful of where it's going. And this shows how, as Sandy was saying, this is all infiltrated into the education system as much as what we're seeing in the real world too. So going on to I'll rush through the solar and farm myths. So it's not cheaper, bills are still rising. We need a parallel energy source for when there's no wind and when there's no sun. They cannot replace fossil fuels. We need them for mining, infrastructure and construction and maintenance. It's funny how mining coal is bad, mining lithium good. These products can't be recycled, so they have to go into landfill, they're potentially toxic. And even if there's damage, you get these huge hailstones of solar farms, you get all the toxic leakage into the soil, which is just convenient because then if the farmers don't want to put the money back into another solar farm, they can only be used for growing, for building on, because they're no longer suitable to go back into farming, but we need our food. So they harm birds, whales, soil organisms, so they're not exactly green. And there are better energy technologies on the way. So we've got thorium. China has just found a huge thorium source. They reckon that they could provide electricity for the Earth for the next 60,000 years just on this one source that they've discovered alone. And they've got a thorium reactor coming online in the Gobi Desert in the next couple of years. So it's not that the technology to use it isn't available either. We've also got hydrogen. Malcolm Bendel's thunderstorm generator, you can look these up on YouTube, and also Maxwell Chikumbutso's microsonic energy device. And he's planning on driving from Harare to somewhere else, a very long Cairo, I think, some very long place far away, without having to refuel, because he's basically taking the energy from the air. So, and when he gets home, he says you plug the house into the car so that you then power the house, not what we're doing it the other way around. As Sandy said, the energy we need for all these data centers, AI, Google and Amazon said they need 4 nuclear reactors just to power their future AI requirements. So you can imagine where the priority, if Keir Starmer says he wants to make UK the centre of a leader in AI, well, you can guess where we're going to be on the priority for electricity when it comes down to it, assuming we can even produce it, Ed Balls. And what a balls up that would be. So we really need to sort of stand up and recognise this for what it is and talk about it. That's what needs to happen. I did a talk to some farmers in Exmoor, and one of the farmers came up to the end and he said, "Great that you did the talk." He said, "You've been saying what we've been thinking individually, but we were too scared to mention because we felt isolated." And so what I would say is talk to people. The biggest way this message gets out is by face-to-face talking. And there's actually an app you can get on your phone that says, it's called Inconvenient Facts. And you can get it on your app and you can go, look, this is the myth that they're basing this all on climate. And this is what we need to overturn, because it's going to ruin us as a country economically and food production. And if you farmers stop producing food, you're the ones that are going to go hungry the same as we are.